I remember Stanley saying something to the effect of that if he could make a film without dialogue, that would be perfection, because you could just go with the music and the imagery and the emotions. That's why silent films were so good. And that's why he loved music. He wanted to make sure that, he wasn't going to make a film that pleased the dumbest person in the audience. He wanted to please the smartest person in the audience. So, in 2001, it had to be accurate. As far as they knew. In Barry Lyndon, the costumes and the games and the lighting had to be accurate. In war films, the story, the details had to be accurate, because otherwise it's not believable. But if you are telling a story that is unbelievable, the details have to make it believable. She dealt with the big subjects: love, jealousy, war, government, corruption. And those are things that affect all human beings. Whether you're in a village in the deepest Amazon, there's still going to be a chief and warriors and fighting over who has the best wife.
The whole world knows Kubrick as a filmmaker, and we will talk about all his different films. But first, we would like to know a little bit about Kubrick, the father, the husband, and the grandfather, whom you have observed personally.
My mother and I left Germany and went to California when I was 4. And Stanley sat me on his knee and said, "Call me Daddy." And so I did. And so I called him up. And, I said, "So, how did it go?" And he said, "They loved it." He said, "I couldn't be happier. I'm as happy as I could possibly be. And, I think it's the best film I've ever made." So he was dead a few days later. So he died on a good note. And so many directors, and I met Christopher Nolan, and he was saying, this film is practically why I went into filmmaking. Stanley would be absolutely thrilled, because young directors would come up to him and say, "Oh, I want to make a movie. How do I do that?" And he said, get a camera and make a film of any kind. Just start.
Hello everyone, welcome to Filmcopan. Today on the occasion of Father's Day, we have a very special guest joining us to talk about a very special father, our most beloved filmmaker, Stanley Kubrick. We have with us the wonderful Katharina Kubrick. Katharina is known for her work on some of the most heartbreaking Stanley Kubrick movies: Eyes Wide Shut, The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, to name a few. Katharina has been doing some great work in holding exhibitions of the works of her father, Stanley Kubrick, all around the world. It is our utter privilege that we have her today with us. Welcome, Katharina, and thank you for coming to Filmcopan.
Hello, nice to be here.
The first question which I want to ask you is, and that's a pretty obvious one. So the whole world knows Kubrick as a filmmaker, and we will talk about all his different films. But first, we would like to know a little bit about Kubrick, the father, the husband, and the grandfather, whom you have observed personally.
Well, Stanley is not my birth father. He's my adopted father. He met my mother Christiana, when he went to Germany to film certain sequences in a film called Paths of Glory, which was his famous anti-war film. Set in the First World War. And he was in Germany, and he was thinking about the ending, and he saw my mother on television in a play called The Three Sisters. And he called up her agent, and she went over to his office, and they had an interview, and she got the job. So the film was shot almost in chronological order. So she didn't shoot her sequence until the film was nearly over. And by that time, they'd fallen in love and they were together. So that was that. That's how they met. And so my mother and I left Germany and went to California when I was 4. And Stanley sat me on his knee and said, "Call me Daddy." And so I did. And he was a very supportive, incredibly encouraging father. Whatever you were interested in, whatever you set your sights on, he said, well, how can I help you get more information or encourage you to do this? So, as you're growing up, you have lots of different things that you want to do. But he never said, oh, don't do that, it's a waste of time. What he didn't like is for you to waste your time. So if you saw that you weren't busy and you walked by his office, he said, have you got 5 minutes, come and Xerox this script for me. I've made 400 copies. So he was a very good father, and he and my mother were both artists, and they were a real team. They really supported each other, and they talked about their work to each other. And my mother would show him his paintings, and Stanley would show my mum his rushes, and they would discuss it. And he liked getting everybody in the family involved, and we would have big meetings at the table, and he'll say, oh, I've just had an idea about this, or look at these drawings, or look at these sketches, or what do you think? He was really very inclusive. And once my first son was born, he was very excited. He liked being a grandfather. He didn't want to be called grandfather, though. So don't call him grandfather. And he taught one of my sons chess, and there again, he was, he loved seeing them. He had a really extraordinary ability, no matter how busy he was, even if he was in the middle of editing. He had such powers of concentration that if you went into his office with a homework problem or another type of problem, he would stop what he was doing, sort it out, and then just get straight back to it. It was amazing.
So, Katharina, we wanted to understand, all these films of Stanley, there are of so many different genres. And, whenever we think about, I'm thinking about a sci-fi genre, and we have a 2001 Space Odyssey. If I'm talking about horror, you have The Shining. If you're talking about anti-war films, there's Dr. Strangelove or Paths of Glory, or, Full Metal Jacket. So kind of, so many genres, and he tops, arguably he tops the films on all of them. So how did, he kind of managed so many different topics, at the same time, one after the other. So was he always reading, or was he always into, whatever is happening in the world? We kind of get fascinated by how one person can make the best film of all different genres.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, that's a good thing to say. He was a voracious reader. And he told me that, he hated school. He wasn't very good at school. He said he didn't read a book for pleasure until he was 17. And he was a photographer, I think for Look magazine. He started very young. I think he sold his first photograph when he was 16 or something. And so he was a staff photographer for Look magazine. And he would go to the movies all the time. And I think he decided that, well, he could have a stab at making a movie, because he surely couldn't make anything worse than the stuff that he was seeing at the cinema. So, and his first efforts were, I think, The Day of the Fight is a short that he made of the Cartier brothers, which is actually really good. And then he made his first sort of fictional feature, which he didn't want anybody to see. It's like letting somebody listening to your piano practice. You don't want anybody to hear that. So, but then what he did, he just looked for stories that would engage him, and that, because you never get that thrill than the first time of reading a book. And then if it really grabs you, and then you have to read it over and over. Now, can you sustain it throughout the length of time it takes to make a film? The pre-production, the shooting, the editing, and all of that stuff that goes on to making a film. Do you love it enough? Is it interesting enough? And so he was constantly looking for stories that would, enliven him and that he would fall in love with. And he wished he made more movies. He was very sad that he didn't make more movies. And in between movies, there were lots of projects that he started that he didn't finish. He fell out of love with them, or the technology wasn't there yet, or it was just too difficult, or the studio said no. I mean, he spent a lot of time working on Napoleon, which is a subject he desperately wanted to do. He had one of the largest private book collections and research on Napoleon of any private person, a vast slide collection. Everything is in numerical order, so you can look up, Talleyrand and find out what he was doing on the 10th of June, and there'll be a card that says he was here and he was doing this. So meticulous research. And then Waterloo came out, which was a film with Rod Steiger, big star-studded movie, and it didn't make any money. And the studio said, no, we're not going to give you the money. So people say, oh, once you're Stanley Kubrick, you can do anything you want. That's not true. The studios still have to back you. And he was very sad. He was very sad. But then there was lots and lots of different topics that he'd pick up and put down again. And I mean, he was going to make AI, and he was working on AI for a really long time, and lots of research and lots of set drawings. And Anton first was hired to do drawings, and we had Chris Baker, who was a fantastic sketch artist and who was visualizing certain scenes, a lot of which are in the movie that Spielberg made. But there were certain scenes in it that required a CGI technology that hadn't been developed yet. So they couldn't do fur, they couldn't do water. So was Teddy going to be an animatronic doll, or was he going to be a CGI Teddy? Was David going to be a real boy, or was he going to be an animatronic boy? He actually photographed my youngest son at the time, who was 3, I think. And there are photographs of him and models thinking that they could use Jack. But ultimately, the technology wasn't there that he had envisioned in his mind. And then one day we were sitting there and he said, you know what, I think I'm going to ask Steven to do it, Steven Spielberg. And we sort of dropped our mouths. And he said, yeah, well, it's more his kind of sensibility. It's more in his line of things. And he'll, if I do it, I'll make it a very dark picture. And I think it's already a really dark, sad picture, actually. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And I think Stephen did a wonderful job. And I'm very glad that he made it. But, there was Aryan Papers that he started, which was about the Second World War. And he did a lot of research on that. I took my children out of school. We were all going to move to Holland. He had engaged an actress. We were really far gone. And then Spielberg brought out Schindler's List. And the studios said, well, we don't really need 2 Nazi films, one after the other, or Holocaust films. And so he dropped it. But it was actually making him really sad. He had so many books, and my mother said she would find him crying over the stuff that he was reading in his research. And even though it was a subject that was very strong to his heart, and it's a story that needs telling, as my mother has said, how could you ask actors to play that? How could you ask actors to be that? It was, it was like any of the atrocities that have happened in many countries all over the world. Why would you, in order to reenact it faithfully, people would be throwing up in the aisles. You couldn't show it, really. She said she was very glad when he dropped it. And then he picked up Eyes Wide Shut, which is a film that he wanted to do for 30 years. And he got the story very, very early on, and it was going to be with Woody Allen at some point, and it was not set in the period ever that Traumnovelle is set in. But when he finished it, so I'm jumping around a bit here, but when he finished the movie and he sent the print to New York for the heads of the studios to see, and Tom and Nick, and he was very nervous. He was always nervous, sending his baby off. So I called him up, and I said, so how did it go? And he said they loved it. He said, I couldn't be happier. I'm as happy as I could possibly be, and I think it's the best film I've ever made. So he was dead a few days later. So he died on a good note. Too early, but on a good note. They loved it.
It really makes you wonder that what could have been, like what we already have, and what could have been if the studios could have backed him with what he. So imagine Stanley's Holocaust film. I mean, I can't really imagine what could have done.
Well, it was actually about a mother and her son, so it wasn't a whole war. It was, you know, about one family, but you only need one family for it to be horrific, don't you? So,
right, yeah. Just wanted to know from you, Katharina, because you've worked with him so closely on few movies, like The Eyes Wide Shut, Shining, Full Metal Jacket, Barry Lyndon. You've worked with him closely, and there are different setups, different countries, the set designs, all are different, since he consciously takes so many different genres to work with. So has there been a difference in his approach from a filmmaking perspective when he has picked up all these different films? So there was like an organic way which he did all of them and maneuvered his way around whenever the topics came.
I wouldn't say his approach was very different. What was most important, once he found a story that he loved and he started working on the screen, or even before he started working on the screenplay, was the research. And research was, you know, the thing that he liked almost the most, apart from editing. And he wanted to make sure that, you know, he wasn't going to make a film that pleased the dumbest person in the audience. He wanted to please the smartest person in the audience. So, you know, in 2001, it had to be accurate, you know, as far as they knew. In Barry Lyndon, the costumes and the games and the lighting had to be accurate. In war films, the story, the details had to be accurate, because otherwise it's not believable. But if you are telling a story that is unbelievable, the details have to make it believable. So in Dr. Strangelove, for instance, their research was so good that Ken Adam, the production designer, said that, you know, if any of the American military had come to see their sets, they better have their research squared away, because they think they'd have a spy at the Pentagon, because it was so accurate. So, you know, you can't have, because there's always going to be somebody in the audience who goes, well, that's not right, or that's a mistake, because people live for that stuff. You know, they like, oh, he made a mistake. They love it. There's always going to be somebody. But, you know, he said, you know, you want to make it real, but just because it's real doesn't make it interesting. So you can be more real than real to accentuate the situation that you're in, which is why when Jack D. Ripper, you know, or George C. Scott were hamming it up and overplaying it. Now, with the knowledge of history and what those colonels were like, it actually wasn't really exaggeration at all, because those people are that crazy. They're just that crazy, and they're that obsessed. So his approach was, let's do, you know, how cheaply can I do it? Because he was always the producer. So I was involved in looking for locations on Barry Lyndon. He had already taught me how to take photographs and print things. So I was cheap labor at home, because, you know, here are some rolls of film, go and develop them and make me 20 prints of each. Okay. And then, so when we moved to Ireland to make Barry Lyndon, I was 19 and I didn't have a job. So he said, okay, you're going to go and look for locations. So I had the script, and I had meetings in the art department with Ken Adam, and we would talk about what we were looking for. And I had the best time, because, you know, I was in my car with my camera taking photographs of lanes and castles and people's living rooms, and it was brilliant fun. But it had to be right. It couldn't be 19th century. It couldn't be 17th century. It had to be 18th century. The interior had to be beautiful. It had to be practical. It couldn't be near traffic. All of those things were taken into consideration. And you always put a very optimistic shooting schedule at the beginning of a film, and you know, his staff would go, yeah, okay, yeah, all right, that's fine, whatever. We'll do it in 90 days. But as far as they was concerned, it's fine because they knew that they would always have a job for longer. Then so then what did I do? Oh, and then I worked for him on The Shining, and I was sent to Alaska to look for a second unit location for when Halloran arrives back from Miami in snow in his airplane. So they thought they could send a second unit up there, and I would have to photograph the establishing shots, find a garage for him to use, and that would be it. But so I went to Phoenix, Arizona, looking for carpets and props for the hotel, Indian rugs, and I met with an Indian tribal rug specialist, and because we'd been looking at books at home, we've been looking at all these books on American tribal art, and he's going, oh, that's nice. And then I got to Arizona, but of course they were art. They were like tens of thousands of dollars, these things. Mm-hmm. And he said, there's no way I'm going to spend that money on a rug on the wall. So of course they had to be copied. So that was disappointing for him. So then I left from Los Angeles to Anchorage, which was a temperature and culture shock. So I arrived on the 26th of December in Anchorage with, 25 feet of snow and 40 degrees below. And it was so cold that I couldn't talk. And and I had a camera with film in it, celluloid. So you're winding it on really slowly so that the film wouldn't snap. So you could only go outside for 2 minutes, take a photograph, and then warm up, and then go outside and take a photograph. Oh, it was a nightmare. It was fun though. But it didn't snow the whole time I was there. It didn't snow. So after 3 weeks, they said, oh, you better come back. You're wasting your time. But I did photograph a petrol garage and took all the measurements, and then they reconstructed it on the studio lot back at Elstree. So that was The Shining. Then on Full Metal Jacket, at first he thought he was going to shoot his battle sequences in sort of rice paddies or something. And so I went to the Spanish Museum and the Portuguese Museum and embassies looking up books of rice paddies and bamboo forests and something exotic, so that it was in Europe still. It meant that he didn't have to go all the way to Vietnam. And so off I went. And I went to this place called Las Marismas, which is in Spain, next to the Guadalquivir River, which goes up to Seville. And I got there, and it turned out to be a nature reserve. And I called, and it was dry because it was summer, and there was no water, and there was no marsh, and there was no nothing. And I called up Dad, and I said, "They're not going to let you blow this up." They're really not. It's a nature reserve. You have to be a scientist to come here. Oh, okay. So I did a lot of that in Spain, and all that was a disaster. And then, but the enthusiasm was there. He thought he could. He thought he could do it. And then when it didn't turn out that way, then, he meant that he could find a location nearby and sleep in his own bed at night. I mean, that's not exactly, too shabby. I think most people would like to be able to sleep in their own bed at night without having to get on an airplane. So Full Metal Jacket was that. And then on Eyes Wide Shut, I just looked for props and lamps and nightgowns for Nicole. And most of the lamps in the Harford's apartment you see are ones that I bought. And most of the furniture in the Harford apartment was from our house, because he couldn't decide how he wanted it to be decorated. And he said, no designer can design something that looks real. And we were standing in the living room. My mother and my father and I were standing. He said, well, that's a nice sofa. And yeah, that's fine. Why don't we just use all this? And my mother's going, really? And he went, yeah. So we didn't have anything to sit on for a year. So, I mean, if I look at Eyes Wide Shut now, the paintings are my mother's, some of them are mine, but the lamps and the chairs and all the knickknacks and candlesticks and vases and everything are all just from our house. So,
was there a brief for the paintings which you and your mother did for Eyes Wide Shut?
No, he just took them off the walls. He said, oh, I'll have that one. Thank you very much. But in the hallway at the beginning of the movie, when Tom and Nicole are going to the Ziegler party, and he's helping her put her coat on, and there's a painting of a cat.
Yes.
That was a painting that I did for him for his 60th birthday of his favorite cat, Polly. And when I saw it in the movie, I just thought, oh, that's nice. It was a sort of a thank you, because he really loved that painting. I mean, what do you give Stanley Kubrick for his birthday? You know?
Yeah. I'm almost glad he's not my dad.
Oh my God, a nightmare. Because he didn't do, you know, he never wore a tie. He didn't wear colognes. He didn't wear fancy clothes. You couldn't buy him a book because he had them all already. I mean, you couldn't give him anything. So I did a painting. So
that's an interesting insight. You know, the problems of having someone like Stanley as your father or relative for that. What's your favorite film of his? Tell me. I mean, we are all split for
ask me that. Don't ask me that. It's because each one is a portion of my life growing up. So, and I worked on them. I visited the sets when I was little. They were part of my life. So I think as I get older, the more serious films have much more meaning to me. I mean, when I first saw Eyes Wide Shut, we were still crying. We just saw the cut that he left, and because my mother and I worked on the posters, and we had to see the movie, and we hadn't seen it. And then he died, and now we had to see it because we had to do the posters. And so I can't tell you what my first viewing of Eyes Wide Shut was, because it was so emotional. But now, you know, I'm divorced. I've been through, you know, relationship trauma like anybody over the age of 20 probably has. And it isn't until you've experienced that sort of horrible part of a life that you kind of understand about jealousy and how people can be so cruel to each other. And so the older I get, the more I understand it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I mean, young people who first saw it, I think it was sold badly. I think people who were expecting to see, people were more prurient. They were expecting to see Tom and Nicole having sex. And they were disappointed when it wasn't, you know, semi-pornographic. And they thought they were going to see something else, whereas in fact it's an incredibly serious and profound and thoughtful film on relationships and marriage and fidelity and jealousy and everything that everybody in the audience is an expert on. I mean, for instance, they had Warner Brothers people sitting outside the cinema in Japan, and they said couples went in but came out holding hands. You know, thinking, okay, we're going to have a talk in the car. You know, you know, there's nobody in the world who hasn't experienced some form of jealousy. And so that story, even though he's moved it a century forward from when it was written, still affects, you know, any sentient being, really. And it's a profound film. What was the question?
Yeah, I think you pretty much answered it. I think.
I think we are also on the same page, because if I watch one of his films today, I think that is the best. And they're so modern. I mean, I was actually, you know, in preparation for this discussion, I was watching Dr. Strangelove again. Oh. And it's absolutely what we have today, isn't it?
Now.
Yes.
Yeah. Except now they're more crazy.
Yes, they are.
Because they have QAnon now.
That war room, you know, the setting and the conversation and everything. I think he always thought ahead of its time, or else how come each of his films are so relevant today? I mean, they do not age.
No, well, because he dealt with real human issues that have been with us since we were hitting over each other over the head over some water. Human beings are always going to kill each other, whether it's because of sex or land or water or space or whatever it is. We're horrible. And that's never going to change. And then, of course, you add religion into the mix. It makes it even more complicated. And I think because he dealt with the big subjects: love, jealousy, war, government, corruption. And those are things that affect all human beings. Whether you're in a, in a village in the deepest Amazon, there's still going to be a chief and warriors and fighting over who has the best wife, all that stuff. So if you deal with the big subjects, they're always going to be relevant until, we're all gone and the world is being run by rats and computers. I don't know. But as again, that was where his search for the ultimate story was, a story that tells the truth, a story that deals with the condition of man or humanity. Barry Lyndon is a perfect case in point. He found this great novel by William Makepeace Thackeray, and it's an overview of arrogance and foolishness and jealousy and greed and avarice and all of those things. And it's a great film because it sort of it watches how everybody is messing up there, but from up here.
Yeah, that's true.
And they're watching, don't do that. Oh my God, you did that. Don't do that. Oh yeah, no, well, he did it. So, and that's why the epitaph at the end of the film, young or old, rich or poor, young, beautiful or ugly, they're all equal. And that is everything. That's what that film is about. But it's told beautifully with candles.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of happening, and when the narration is happening, it's so detached from whatever is happening. Things which people are killing and dying and making a mess of everything. It's being told in such a detached, in a cool, like it always happens way.
Yeah, so you can't look away. You can't look away. I mean, you've seen Paths of Glory, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that wonderful scene with Kirk Douglas and Adolphe Menjou and the other actor whose name has escaped me, when he's, says, do you think I'm doing this for my own personal gain? You horrible old man. That is such a powerful scene. And that's what it was actually banned in France for decades, that film. And his shock that the Colonel thinks that he's doing it for personal embetterment. And then that's what politicians do all the time. And, military, that's what they do all the time. General Flynn in the United States wants a coup. He wants to have Myanmar in America. So nothing changes. Nothing changes. It's depressing.
How did he used to deal, with these controversies? Like I remember for Dr. Strangelove, I think I have read he was accused of treason, and then Paths of Glory being banned. Yeah.
All the gold in China, all the gold in Russia couldn't have, made a more treasonous film. People don't like to be told the truth. Mm-hmm. And there was the Cold War. I mean, we nearly moved to Australia. I mean, if it wasn't for Kennedy, I think, the Cuban cruise missile crisis was a very, very scary moment. And then, and I think we're at that moment now with, the nuclear proliferation is instead of getting better, they're now talking about having a survivable nuclear war. It doesn't get more terrifying than that. So they haven't learned anything. It's the arrogance of the military.
Yeah, so true. I mean, yeah. So when these things reached him, how did he deal with it? Was he very, very upset, or did it at all, kind of unsettle him, or he was expecting things like this by the way the films were being made?
No artist expects everybody to love their art. And he was disappointed. And he but they didn't understand it. And people are always going to disagree, and you're always going to have the right wing and the left wing and the people confused, accusing everybody of everything. So he was disappointed. He wanted. The thing is that the people who mattered liked it. That's what's important. Is the right people liked it. And he had people sending him their ticket stubs from 2001, saying they wanted their money back, and they'd never seen so much rubbish. And Pauline Kael, who was a New York film critic at the time, incredibly arrogant, said that she thought that 2001 was monumentally unimaginative. So I think that was her talking about herself, really. And he was incredibly disappointed that Barry Lyndon didn't do very well in America or in the UK. Did very well in Portugal, and in the Latin countries, it did very well. But he didn't. He was hurt and he was upset, but he didn't let that stop him. Because a lot of people would let that say, "Oh, nobody likes my work, I'm going to give up." And he didn't do that. So good for him.
When you talked about 2001: A Space Odyssey, I would like to bring Shining into the mix. When The Shining was made, somebody had the gall to give him a Razzie Award for that. I mean,
Shining?
Yes, for The Shining, there was this a Razzie Award was given, first director. Stanley Kubrick, and I'm like, are you out of your mind? Do you not understand subtext at all, or how horror works? So it's I really don't understand what kind of ambiguity is there. Like you should celebrate something like that, and you are trying to belittle a work which probably will not happen in 100 years. So it was truly disturbing when I read about that. Actually,
it never made a profit. Shining never made a profit, but now it's on sort of the top 10 list of everybody's horror film list, and it's iconic, and people dress up as the twins, and Jack Nicholson's face coming through the door is used in ads and all sorts of things. So what can you
even if someone is telling 2001 is unimaginative, and it kind of wraps up you in its imagination itself, and only after 20 minutes it starts, that narrative that we were used to till then, that starts, and calling it unimaginative. I mean, I cannot imagine that. How come someone thinks that way?
2001 is like a poetry in motion, really, like with distant acts. I mean, it's you cannot get more closer to perfection of filmmaking than what 2001 did at so many different levels. That's what I feel.
Yeah, I think that I remember Stanley saying something to the effect of that if he could make a film without dialogue, that would be perfection, because you could just go with the music and the imagery and the emotions. That's why silent films were so good. And that's why he loved music, and he used music very effectively. Music was always playing in the house, and when he was editing, music was always on, listening. And it was actually how I learned the difference that a conductor makes, because when he was listening to different variations of the Blue Danube for 2001, obviously he listened to different conductors. So it was Karajan, and Schulte and various other, and you hear them back to back, and you go, oh, okay, now I understand. He wanted to find the perfect rhythm, and he was a very good dancer, and he liked waltzing. He was a secret dancer. He liked waltzing, and so the circles of space and the circles that our planets make around our sun, everything is spinning, and you're spinning in a waltz, and the spaceships are spinning, and it all just became very sort of homogenized and natural. And what's interesting now is that the Blue Danube, for instance, and at the beginning, the Strauss, the Zarathustra, have now become synonymous with space travel. And children will say, oh, they hear the Blue Danube, and they don't say that's a waltz. They go, oh, that's space music. But when he made it, as I said, he was a great reader, and he was reading a lot of science fiction, and he liked Arthur C. Clarke, and he read his short story called The Sentinel. And so Arthur C. Clarke wrote the book, 2001, after the movie, or while the movie was being made. And they worked on it together, and they just wanted to make the most accurate science fiction film they could with all the knowledge that they had at the time. So because remember, they didn't land on the moon until the following year, till 69.
Yes.
And then Stanley and Arthur Clarke, we were still in New York, it was 1964, and they would go around to all the modern art galleries and look at all the sculpture and look at all the modern paintings and look at all the modern design of knives and forks and furniture, and, you know, to make it as spacey as possible. And they had experts from NASA, they had experts from, anthropological experts. They had, in fact, the mammoth skull at the beginning of the movie, at the dawn of man, was actually from the Cambridge Museum. And they rented it, and they found the receipt recently because they've still got it. So it's a real mammoth skull. Anyhow, so when they landed on the moon, and of course we as a family, like the rest of the world, were glued. You probably weren't born yet, were you? But we were watching it on television, and then suddenly we saw our Earth for the first time, and he went, "Damn it!" He said, "I didn't get it the right color," and he was all cross because the model of the Earth in 2001 is very pale blue and very misty, because they were guessing. They didn't know, not really. And so he was a bit cross. I think if he'd been able to CGI it in, he would have, but that didn't exist then. So yeah.
I think what has been achieved in 2001 without CGI has not been achieved with CGI in so many movies. I mean, there's absolutely
that kind
amazing.
of a technical innovation in the 68. I mean, unbelievable. And
yeah, you can't see the strings, can you?
No.
And I mean, that's a film which make you realize that he might not be just a filmmaker. He was a philosopher. He was a thinker, or else that kind of a vision does not come out. You know.
I miss his wisdom. I miss his being able to, watch the news and discuss things about. He'd be very sad now. He'd be really distraught at what's going on in the world. But I miss his advice. And just being able to call him up and say, "Oh, this happened or that happened, or what do you think?" Or "I don't know what to do." And he always had the answer for everything. And if he didn't know the answer, he was one of the, he could just, "Let me make a phone call," and he'd pick up the phone and he'd call somebody and find out. So he was great that way.
Since you talk about the moon landing, and pardon me for asking me this.
Yeah, we know a different story.
and I'm really sorry to do this to you, but I just want to know that what was his reaction to this whole controversy surrounding The Shining and the symbolism in Shining and relating it to the moon landing. So how did he take it? How did he react to it?
I think that a lot of this stuff has come out since he died. And, we all know now more than ever how conspiracy theories get completely, blown out of all proportion, especially, with social media and people just going into their rooms and talking crazy talk to each other. And you see what you want to see. If you want it badly enough, you can imagine it. You can have the fantasy. Your eyes can practically play tricks on you. You say, "Oh, there's a light there. Oh, that's not moving." Or I'm sure that's a face. I'm sure that's something. And look, there are people who think that the Earth is flat. Okay. So once you're dealing with that level of crazy, it's like talking to a duck. You can't have any conversation with them. And, when people say to me, oh, Stanley filmed the moon landing, he did hear the moon landing one. And he said, oh, well, he said, I'm glad they think that I have so much power. But it's also incredibly disrespectful to all the hundreds of thousands of people and the millions of dollars that worked at NASA. It's disrespectful to the people who lost their lives. It's disrespectful to Stanley to think that he would do something so terrible and deviant. It's people not having a large enough imagination to think that, they made several lenses. Stanley thought, I'll buy 3 of those. He ruined one of them to put on, he ruined a camera to have the lens put on the BNC Mitchell, and especially adapted, because he had vision, he had foresight, he knew what he wanted, he knew what he wanted to do. He was a photographer, he knew his lenses, he spent the money. All his camera equipment was his, he owned it. Right. Because he figured, why not buy it rather than just keep spending out renting it, and then maybe getting a lens that's scratched or doesn't work properly, or somebody else has used it and they've broken it, or blah, blah, blah. So he saved a fortune. It's much better to own the ladder than rent the ladder.
Yes.
So
have you actually watched this documentary Room 237, Katharina?
Actually, I will confess that I have not, because people who I love and respect said, if I watch it, it'll make me crazy. But I should, because people keep asking me. The thing is, I know it's made by fans. And they say, oh, the rooms don't make sense in the hotel. It's a film set about a ghost hotel. They don't have to make sense. And, you have to suspend your disbelief long enough to get into the story. Have you seen Dr. Sleep?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I saw that and it wasn't quite finished. And it was a very freaky experience. I mean, I am not a horror film fan at all. I don't watch horror films. But we went to see it, and there was just 3 of us in the screening. And it was Flanagan, isn't it? He'd done such a good job of recreating the Overlook Hotel. It was like another film crew had broken into the set at night and filmed a secondary film, back in the day. I thought it was brilliant. It was really, really well done. And people weren't complaining about the fact that, the rooms didn't make any sense. The thing about The Shining is it's about, dysfunctional families, it's about somebody who's going crazy. It's about a ghost hotel. It's past history and somebody slowly losing his mind. Logic does not come into it anywhere in the story at all. And the other talk about Danny's Apollo sweater. So Milena Canonero, who was the costume designer, had a friend who was a knitter. And she said, oh, I've just made this, cool sweater with this spaceship on it. Should I, so that was that. It was just sort of a friend doing it. But if you don't know about Milena's history, so Milena was a family friend, and she was friends with Ken Adam, the production designer, and his wife Letizia, and they would come for dinner. And Stanley was working on Clockwork Orange, and Milena was one of those incredibly beautiful, very elegant Italian women, always immaculately dressed. And so they were all having dinner and having wine. They were talking about costumes for Clockwork Orange. And they were all sort of, well, what should we do and how should we dress them? Because it was set in the near future. And he just looked at Milena one day and he said, well, you always look nice. You have great taste. Why don't you dress them? And that is literally how her career in film started. You have good taste. You do it. And she's got 5 Oscars now or something. So so she did Barry Lyndon as well, obviously.
So many, backstories and subtext exaggerations and all of that, particularly for Shining. I think people have written theses on subtext analysis of Shining. So almost all you think, it just happened. It's nothing that there is any kind of backstory. And like you relate to this, to that, and all of that.
But the hotel was built on an Indian burial ground. Yes, that's true. And that's in the book. And that's right. So if you want to, but it doesn't have anything to do with the Holocaust. I've read that that's got something to do with the Holocaust. If you want to say in the Holocaust in terms of the decimation of the American tribes, that was a different Holocaust, if you want to liken it to that rather than the Second World War. Maybe that's what they're talking about, is the destruction of the tribes in America. But it wasn't a deliberate thing, and the interior design of the Overlook was taken because of the design of the Timberline Lodge, which is the real hotel in Oregon, and because of where it is. It's very typical American decoration for that area. Okay, you have a lot of Navajo buildings and carpets, curtains, and rugs and jewelry and all of that stuff. It is of the area, and it's very effective. It looks very beautiful. And it's a very good thing that a lot of the carpets weren't authentic ones, is because that set burnt down, luckily, just after they'd finished shooting. So there's a photograph on the internet of Stanley in the smoldering ruins of the set of the Overlook Hotel. And he's laughing. And I think that's a laugh of relief, because they said, "Oh, a man's crazy." He said, "No," he said, he's laughing because he finished shooting and he didn't have to rebuild it. That's why he's laughing.
There are so many stories about the film, the shooting continuing for a long time and he taking so many shots. We have heard that in Eyes Wide Shut and Shining. He wanted to take more shots and then, get the kind of maybe, the more realistic and the raw acting from his actors. So is it something like that? What was this idea of taking so many shots?
Well, throughout his history, I was certainly there on set where the actor couldn't remember their lines, or the actor was drunk and had actually been up till 4 o'clock in the morning drinking. And I remember that very clearly. Or the actor didn't know what to do, or the actor wasn't quite in the mood, or it was something where, why does a composer keep changing the notes in his concerto? Why does the painter keep changing the lines? You keep making adjustments and adjustments and adjustments until you're satisfied that it's right. And I'm assuming that you're referring to Wendy's character. Yes. That was a very difficult role. There's no question that was a very difficult role to play. But I'm often watching movies and watching the actors, in freezing cold water, hanging off a cliff, in a tree, getting beat up. Acting's difficult. Sometimes you have to really be very uncomfortable. And I'm sure that Jack and Stanley were probably not as sensitive to her as they should have been, and they were just being guys. But people have told me, "Oh, Stanley was cruel and he tortured her." He was not at all, and they would spend hours talking and together very calmly. And she admired him. I think a lot of it's been completely. They've taken a very small thing and they've gone like this. Stanley was not a shouter. He was very quiet on stage, and he was very collaborative. As Keir Delay told me one time, he said, "I was very well cast. Stanley cast well. You choose the actors who can do what you want them to do, and you trust them to do their job." He said to Matthew Modine came up to me and, "Stanley, I don't know what you want me to do." And Stanley said, "Well, don't do anything. Just be yourself. That's why you're here." You don't employ somebody to dig the road and then dig it yourself.
Yeah.
You let them do, you choose the actor you think can do the job, and then you let them do it. And then they did spend an inordinate amount of time discussing it. They would go off and trailer, they would have dinner, and they would talk about the role. They would talk about the parts. And sometimes the actor didn't know what to do. But maybe, when you are tired and you're not remembering your lines anymore, you're remembering it because you know it like you know your name and you are that character. Suddenly, sometimes the gear will shift somewhere else and suddenly there'll be something. And Nicole Kidman said, they're always looking for the magic. You don't know when just the way you move your face or move your body or you say the words, sometimes something it's desperate. And he filmed everything. It's like theater will rehearse for weeks and weeks and weeks before they put on the show. So on a film set with a very small crew, so it's cheaper, very, very small crew, time is the luxury. And Stanley said to me one time, he said, look, I've got very expensive movie stars, I've got a very expensive set. The film running through the camera is the cheapest part of all of this. Why not film it? There's a scene in Barry Lyndon where Barry's given his son a horse and the boy goes off to the horse. And you see the boy falling. And they were just rehearsing. And that was the only shot they did because it was perfect. But they had film running through the camera. And then sometimes actors will, it's not a perfect science. And all directors direct differently. And actors respond differently to directors. And actors who become directors change, the way they are with other actors. It's not an exact science. And you have to find your own way through it. There's no right or wrong way. And there'll always be a world of people who will criticize you for doing it. But you do it the way you do it, and you hope that the actors will fall in love with the project like you do, and that you're all simpatico with each other, and you're like this. But it's not easy when actors are drunk and can't remember their lines.
Would you say that these things were like slightly blown out of proportion because it was Stanley?
Of course. Everybody likes to read something bad about a famous person. Makes them more interesting, doesn't it? You don't want to say, oh, he's really famous and he's really nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's boring. Can't we read about something terrible he did? Kick his cat or something. People don't want to read nice things about famous people. It's much more interesting. It's like the newspaper said, if it bleeds, it leads.
What did you think about his contemporaries? We have heard that Orson Welles was a big influence. And then he kind of wanted Spielberg to do this film. I mean, Spielberg was a choice from Stanley himself.
They were friends. And as I said before, when he was talking about AI, he said, I think I want Steven to direct it. I'll produce it because I'll make it too dark. I'll make it too heavy. I think AI is already a pretty dark, serious film. But he liked lots of directors, and he would call directors up and say, I really liked your movie, or, how did you do this, and pick their brains. He famously wrote Bergman a fan letter. And he was a filmmaker. He loved films. It's like if you're a chef, you don't only eat your own food.
Yeah. Talk us through this Stanley Kubrick exhibition, which you have done at various places, and what was the kind of response, and what you plan to do in future.
Well, okay. So Stanley had died, and we had a house full of all his stuff that he'd saved and put away in boxes. And we were all very sad, didn't know what to do with it, because he didn't throw anything away. And in fact, somebody made a documentary called Stanley Kubrick's Boxes. You'll probably see it on YouTube by Ron Johnson, or John Ronson, sorry. And there was an exhibition of, let me get this right, Ken Adams film set designs. And the Deutsche Film Museum people were there. And they approached my mother. It was a fantastic film museum in Frankfurt. Fantastic film. Museum, and they have, you know, old cameras and wonderful exhibitions. And if you ever are in Frankfurt, you have to go there. Anyhow, so they approached my mother and said, you know, we'd really like to put on an exhibition of Stanley's archive. And at first she was very resistant because she said, oh, it means opening up all the boxes and the paper's gone all yellow and it's sad and I'm going to cry. And she was then thinking, well, but I'm an artist. I would really like to see Cézanne's sketchbook. I would really like to see Picasso's paints. I would really like to see Bonnard's easel. I would really like to see Titian's studio, because you want to see how the people who you admire, what their work ethic was like. So she agreed. So Deutsche Film Museum sent over an archivist who was at our house for 9 months with his white gloves, putting on and going through all the boxes and slowly picking out things that they thought would be really interesting. So the first Stanley Kubrick exhibition was in Frankfurt, and that was 19 cities ago. And it's been to Paris, Rome, Melbourne, Zurich, Rio. It's been to Mexico. It's been to Los Angeles. It's been to Montreal. And each time, each space, each museum, each curator, I mean, it's always the same stuff, but they add certain different things to it because the space is different, or they'll have an artist lend them something. I mean, they had the exhibition last time was in London in 2019. It was a huge success, and they were expecting 58,000 visitors, and they had 220,000 visitors.
Oh.
And they got the Durango car from Clockwork Orange. They managed to get hold of the sculptor who had the dancing Jesuses from Clockwork Orange. So they had a lot of extra things, and there was a lot of space. And we're hoping that it will go to Madrid at the end of the year. I mean, COVID has kind of, you know, messed things up. But, you know, it's never been to India. It's never been to China. It's never been to Japan. It's been to Seoul in South Korea. And, you know, so it's gone wherever people love film. And, you know, all you have to do is find a space that's big enough, or a museum, or a huge, because it takes a lot of space. So you need a huge art gallery or a film museum or just a general museum, and a curator who is familiar with the films. And then you contact the people at Frankfurt and they go, right, we want an exhibition, and then you make a deal. Quite honestly, it was news to me, Arup, that Stanley's films are popular in India. I know that there's a huge film industry, but I was surprised to learn that he was so popular.
He is worshipped, actually.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
okay.
You see, this is a shining poster.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I saw that.
I have a T-shirt wearing, and I have a book here, so it's pretty much worshipped.
Oh, okay. You know, we will have to get over this COVID nonsense and you know, tornadoes and typhoons and crazy governments, and then maybe we can kind of get the world back to something.
True, so true.
Oh my God. But the thing is, it's, you know, if you have the contacts and if you have the names, then you know, that's a start.
Yeah. Katharina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay.
And we never expected that we will just reach out to you and you will respond. It was really fortuitous for like that happened so quickly, and you poured your heart out in this discussion as well. You were so jovial, and then you talked so much from your heart. We are really grateful for this. Thank you so much, Katharina.
Well, I love talking about my dad, and you know, to get the word out, because the thing is, you know, as long as people remember you, you don't die. And I think that if you have left the world great art, the people who can should talk about it, because so many people, you know, because fashions change. And I'm very aware that Stanley's films now are old films. you know, the last film he made was 22 years ago. You know, a lot of people weren't even born yet, and they don't even know who Stanley Kubrick is. And you know, it's you have to keep it alive, and that's why, you know, any art, whether it's music or sculpture or painting or dance or theater, you have to keep it alive. If you don't keep putting wood in the fire, it's going to go out.
Yeah, but then, you know, as we were talking about if he's popular in India, so I'll just give you a trivia. We had a film festival in Kolkata, and they had a Stanley Kubrick retrospective.
Oh my God.
However, considering that, you know, these are films which mostly people have watched, you know, at least the cinephiles might have previously watched, the retrospective, you know, the timings were all 9 in the morning, you know, each day at 9 in the morning you have a Kubrick film. I went for, you know, 3 of them. It was a packed house, and it's one of the biggest theaters in the country. And I was amazed. And when I spoke to a couple of guys, they were like, who can lose a chance to watch 2001 on a big screen? I mean, they were all skipping their offices for watching that.
Fantastic. Oh my God, that is so nice to hear.
That's him. That's Stanley.
That's fantastic. I mean, I'm going to tell my mum, because my mum's coming over for lunch tomorrow, and so I'm going to tell her. But so she'll be thrilled. But I've also seen it. 2001, they did a thing with a live orchestra.
Yes.
Oh my God. Mm-hmm. So you had the 2 choirs, the male choir and the female choir, and a full orchestra. And at the beginning of the movie, when those cellos start, you can feel it here. And the ground is vibrating, and it's coming up. And then they play the full thing, and you see the moonrise coming up, and everybody's going like, whoa. It's amazing. It's amazing. And I hope Daddy's spirit is up there somewhere, you know, seeing how much people still love that movie. At his 50th anniversary, I was in Cannes at the film festival.
We watched that video, yes.
And that was incredible. The audience was packed. It was the first time they had a red carpet event for a classic film. And the love for that film is huge. And so many directors, and I met Christopher Nolan, and he was saying, you know, this film is practically why I went into filmmaking. And so many people say that to me. And, you know, Stanley would be absolutely thrilled, because young directors would come up to him and say, oh, you know, I want to make a movie. How do I do that? And he said, get a film and get a camera and make a film of any kind. Just start. And now, of course, where you don't need film, you don't need short ends, you don't need processing costs. You have everything is on your chip. I mean, I've been filmed with a still camera, and all of the really, really hard physical work has been taken away. So now it's almost more important than ever to do something that's interesting. A lot of people make lazy films. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And films that, you know, by the time you've got to your car, you've forgotten what it was about. Yeah. And if you're going to make a film, you have, and that's where Stanley made films, you have to make a film that lasts. You have to make a film that speaks for humanity. Otherwise, why bother? Why do it?
Absolutely.
She said. Now, I'm going to go and have a cup of tea now.
Sure,
and it was lovely talking to you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Katharina.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.